Hello and welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson and I'm joined today by my co-hosts Giulia and Heather Dinwoody. Today we're going to have a chat about 3 stories we think are interesting and tell us something about the world in which we live. Giulia, can we kick off with you?
The 3rd of May was World Press Freedom Day, and this year it was dedicated to the importance of journalism and freedom of expression amid the climate and biodiversity crisis. So misinformation on these issues is very dangerous because it can lead to a lack of public and political support for climate action, as well as effective policies and protection for the people that are most vulnerable. A study published last week by UNESCO found that 70% of environmental journalists have suffered attacks related to their work. So the agency conducted a consultation in March 2024, interviewing 900 environmental journalists across 129 countries. And over 2/3 of them declared that they had suffered attacks, threats, or pressure linked to their activities. Of the people that declared the attacks, 2 out of 5 had actually suffered physical violence. And so, if we want more figures, between 2009 and 2023, at least 749 journalists and media covering these environmental issues were victims of murder, physical violence, detention and arrest, and online harassment of prosecution. So I didn't know the UNESCO Observatory of Murdered Journalists existed, and it found that 44 murders of environmental journalists have happened in the last 15 years, and only 5 of them resulted in convictions. So 90% of them went unpunished. And then there is another report also from the UNESCO that was published earlier this year, which found a really concerning trend where journalists have been targeted by the police. For example, in France and Spain, journalists covering environmental protests have been arrested, detained, and prosecuted as if they were taking part in a demonstration. And then, as in Sweden, one journalist was arrested, strip searched, and held in custody for 6 hours, and their equipment was confiscated. And so this is happening on top of journalists also being denied access to or prevented from filming these demonstrations and civil disobedient actions. Sometimes they're being physically removed from the site. And sometimes they, like for example in Spain, they've been denied access to this narrow street where the police had managed to push all the activists. So they were, surrounded by police. So this is a big problem because we need transparency, right? People care more about environmental issues these days. It's possible that in the past you could turn more of a blind eye and maybe the bad actors would go unpunished. But now there is a real demand for the truth and transparency. And we really need to have journalists being able to do their job. And I know that there are problems around press. Some of them are biased, but there are so many honest journalists out there. And on top of this, my thought is that, I follow the journalism industry a lot because I'm a journalist, and there is a real problem with funding. So there isn't really a business model that works universally. And so we have a problem with funding the important investigations that we need, because investigations require a long time and, they don't deliver the quick results that one might want. And so they are quite difficult to fund. And then on top of that, we've got journalists being attacked. And I mean, it sounds like we really need to find ways to protect them, even as the public. I'm sure that there are ways that we can follow their work, support their work financially, or, being vocal on social media about appreciating what they're doing.
Absolutely. And it's not just about protecting people that are already in those journalistic roles. In providing protection for them, you're also providing the safeguards that people will still be encouraged to go into that field. Because if people are looking at this and seeing just sort of escalating levels of violence and danger, how can we hope to have it continue into the future? You won't have that next generation of journalists coming up.
Yeah, I mean, there is this feeling that being a journalist is a sacrifice. And especially for these stories, for these environmental investigations, it's a sacrifice in terms of, your safety, your finances, because, as I said, these are really expensive. Sometimes they don't get funded. Sometimes people just do it and hope that, at their expense, and hope that they will be able to sell it. And so this is not really an industry that is making it easy in any way, shape, or form. And I think that's why I said we need to find ways to support them.
I think there's a really interesting thing here, though, that we live in a sort of, to be blunt, a bubble of privilege in a democratic country where we take these rights for granted. The idea of journalism as the thing that speaks truth to power, the idea that, it is not just about keeping an eye on everything, as you said, Heather. It's about calling on for accountability on behaviour. But what you've got here as well, don't forget, is a system where, because of climate change, a lot of the ways in which we've traditionally done business and operated are going to have to change. And a lot of companies don't like that. And a lot of politicians don't like that because it's upsetting and it's disturbing and it means people are uncomfortable. And I think one of the hardest conversations we have to have as a society is that there is going to be a lot of discomfort. There's going to be upheaval. We have to understand it. And one of the best ways we can do that is not to bury our heads in the sand, but actually to ensure that we do support people in telling us what's going on and why it's going on.
It is about accountability and transparency, but I think we've got a bit too comfortable in kind of taking that for granted without thinking of the dangers these people are in. And even, some of the stories you mentioned there, I think I've been sort of vaguely aware of the challenges that environmental journalists are facing in some parts of the world, but places like, that story you told from Sweden, it's a bit closer to home than I maybe would have imagined.
I think probably we should move on. Heather.
And I wanted to chat today about the UK government being defeated for a second time in the High Courts over its lack of a credible plan on climate action. So, three organisations, it was Friends of the Earth, Client Earth, and the Good Law Project, took the UK to court again to say that it just did not have a credible plan for how it was going to meet its climate targets. And their main sort of argument was that although I think about 3,000 pages of extra detail have been added to the climate plan, and it now details how each one of the government's policies is going to reduce emissions, but there was no sort of risk management. There was no, okay, but what if this policy doesn't work? They had literally just sort of said, okay, we'll tick, 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 tick. And the former energy secretary had signed that off and said, yep, that'll all work. And the judge, I think it was Judge Sheldon, has ruled that there just wasn't enough checks in place. They had just said, okay, we'll match that policy to a result and expect no hiccups in the meantime. And as we all know, politics and the delivery of policy, it's full of hiccups. And the UK's Climate Change Committee had actually said that despite this 3,000 extra pages of detail, it is now less confident in the government's plan than it has ever been. And this is really concerning, obviously, and it's very good news that we have had this success in court because that forces the government to go back and do this all again. But I think what's quite interesting is just sort of the place we're at in UK politics anyway. We've just had our local elections, we've got a general election coming up, and it's looking more and more likely by the day that we are going to have a pretty big change in government. And it just makes me wonder about that sort of balance between the electoral cycle and the sort of the time that you have to hold people accountable, because it's great that we've been able to hold this present government to account and say this isn't good enough, but by the time they go back and review things, it seems very likely that we're going to have a different government. And you just wonder sort of what the responsibilities are there. Is politics moving faster than courts can? But then what other avenues do we have?
And how many times can we go back to the drawing board? Like, is it a constant back and forth? Like, a second time is too many.
Well, I think that's the main reason for the drop in the Climate Change Committee's confidence. It's not necessarily that the plan has got worse, although we have seen, new oil and gas licenses approved in the meantime, but we've also lost a year or so. And that is going to eat into the credibility of any climate plan. The less time you have, the less credible it becomes.
If you were going to be negative about it, you might question as to whether or not the government is choosing to not do terribly good work on its plans in order to have it tackled and targeted and sent back to the courts, so that it takes longer and longer and longer before they actually have to put anything into play. But obviously, I'm not that cynical.
Yeah, I mean, the Climate Change Committee said they didn't like it. Their job is to keep an eye on it. So I don't know if they don't change it after the committee says they don't like it. I mean, to me, it just sounds, I have to agree with you, Fee. It to me sounds like a little bit of a delay tactic because, as you said, Heather, it's likely we're going to have a change of government. At this point, it seems convenient, perhaps, to just leave it to whoever comes next.
I mean, last I heard, our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, hadn't actually read the judge's ruling. The statement given by the UK government was that, we've made excellent progress on climate action and the court is not the best way of judging our progress.
I think that what's happening with the current government is that it's resting on its laurels a little bit about climate change action because they keep saying we are doing so well, we are a leader, we had the net zero plan before everyone else, and that's true, but the leadership has gone. Other jurisdictions, other countries are doing so much better. And so I feel that they're sort of happy with what's been achieved a few years ago. And now, even if it's basically kind of being undone, at least in certain ways, like certain policies have certainly been delayed or cancelled or whatever, they're still feeling like we are the best in the world.
Well, that's what I'm coming to, because you're thinking, the court shouldn't have to be used. The government has made a commitment. It is its job to do that. But if it's not going to, then court action is the option available. What other option is there?
Well, if you think about it, again, not that I'm being cynical, but the sorts of things that politicians and newspapers are focusing on at the moment, they're not really paying attention to this underlying challenge that is facing all of us. It's all, can we get people on planes to Rwanda? Not what's the long-term implications for whether I'm going to have a job or not, or is my industry going to fall apart, or is the UK going to become competitive? And not to pick up on a particularly difficult political topic, but I was having a conversation yesterday with a friend who did remind me that it was slightly peculiar that a government that is focused on growth decided to cut off its own access to 300 million people with loads of money that are 22 miles away from the UK. There just seems to be this disconnect between what people say they want to do and what they're doing.
I think this comes back to the point I was making about electoral cycles, because governments are working, well, the UK government is working to this 4-year need to be back in again. And if it takes a back and forth with the court, so that, if a government comes in, even if we do have this change in government, there's no telling how long it will last, how many cycles it will pass through. So you think, okay, well, if every government were to spend 3 years going back and forth reviewing their plan, then you've got the opportunity for another one to come in. And this is what I mean about the courts work a lot slower than these electoral cycles, and we need a system that sort of encourages the people to think in the long term rather than just thinking of their next election.
Yeah, I think the problem is that everyone is using the excuse of the economic crisis, which is certainly a problem, a big problem, but we should find the opportunity in addressing the climate crisis instead of rowing back, because we just need to make money. Money for, like, in what way? Because ultimately it is Shell and the shareholders that are making the money, not the ordinary people.
Absolutely, and we can say for balance, it's not just the current government that has gone back on its plans. Labour have also eaten into their commitment. We've had the SNP recently, all that drama unfolding. Everyone's going back and forth on these things. Meanwhile, I think Shell has just exceeded its profit expectations dramatically and awarded its shareholders a whole bunch of money.
I think it's interesting when you consider that the majority of the reason why the UK's emissions are lower is because we shifted from coal to gas early, and that was a political decision based on a desire to break the unions, not to not to be very shorthanded in the way in which I talk about UK history. But it does feel to the interested observer that every time you hear about policy these days, it's a move backwards. It's something being unwound. It's something going in the wrong direction. It's something that's a distraction. And when you consider that we're supposed to be moving to what, can only be called a net zero future, it's concerning that fossil fuel companies are still making billions upon billions in profit. They're not investing in clean energy in the same way that they were. The whole shift towards a greener future and the green transition doesn't seem to be getting the framing that it needs to have, which is this is an opportunity to change the way we do what we do.
There's a new report out the other day. I don't know if either of you saw it, but it was about this sort of proposed tax on oil and gas companies in G7 countries. And the way they'd worked it out, you could have, I can't remember, sort of 9 billion in climate finance for lesser developed countries, but then also still some money there to ease the transition to sort of support new, cleaner industries, whether it's electric transportation or renewable energy in the countries where this tax had been applied. And you just think, there are solutions out there. We just need people who are brave enough to take that step and say, this is going to be unpopular for a bit, but the future you have is going to be a whole lot brighter.
I think that's the thing that I find really interesting, that everything is, when you look at politics, it all feels so consistently negative. There doesn't seem to be anyone out there who's got a grand vision, who can actually say, and admit it. It's going to be hard, but if we work together, we can actually do these things. One of the things I've never really understood about big business just wanting to consistently make more money for the sake of making more money is you have to have people out there to buy your products. Because if people can't afford to live, they're not going to buy your stuff and the whole system's going to fall over. Maybe I wasn't designed to think about economics in the right way, but it just feels so foolish. Anyway, listen, on that note, I'm going to bring in my story because this week I actually wanted to talk about a report that came out of the Grantham Institute, which is, funnily enough, a little bit about economics, but actually it's about the impact of climate change on the labour market. And this is something that's very important to politicians because obviously if labour markets are tight, if there aren't enough people able to do the work, it puts wages up. It's difficult for businesses to compete to attract people. That leads to wage inflation, which can then lead to wider inflation. And actually what the Grantham Research Institute analysis showed is that actually labour shortages could be one of the key barriers to transition, one of the key barriers to achieving the Paris Agreement goals. So even if the countries have got enough money to invest in climate adaptation and mitigation, which is open to question depending on which country it is, they may not have the people, the labour, the ability to build the infrastructure, to build the renewable energy projects, or to transform the manufacturing projects that they need to. And this is what's really interesting here for me, Heather, is that when you're talking about whether or not politicians are moving fast enough, whether the courts are a bit too slow, but actually set parameters for change, one of the things about problems with the labour markets is that it's something that central banks get really interested in, that financial supervisors get really interested in, which might sound a bit sort of, nerdy and not that interesting. But basically, central banks and financial supervisors are responsible for keeping financial stability. And if you start looking at how labour markets affect financial stability, you start seeing the problems that we're actually going to face in the transition. So actually, the analysis showed that we're likely to see labour shortages within the G20, in the US, the UK, the EU, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Saudi Arabia. Now, this is a range of different countries at different stages and, different levels of appetite. But the argument suggests that we're going to need about 13 million extra workers just across the G20 just to meet the growth in demand for green industries. So renewable energy, electric vehicles, electric heat pumps. So, and that's happening at a time where there's already pressures on the workforce. And these things have got to be addressed. And I think it's really critical that politicians get together with businesses and with NGOs and with everyone else and actually has a serious conversation about what's going on. There are issues around the impact of technology on labour productivity, on displacement. New technologies can be really, really positive, but they can have unintended consequences. This has to be dealt with. But then at the same time, there's actually the risk of climate change itself. Because one of the things that is not being talked about enough is the potential impact of heat on productivity. It sounds really boring, but I believe the numbers are that under a 1.5 degree scenario, and to be honest, most of us agree we're not going to get that, heat waves are going to increase to the level that it's going to probably wipe out about 2% of the total hours worked every year. That doesn't sound that much, does it? Except that's equivalent to 78 million full-time jobs. So if you're in a hot area and your productivity falls that much, what's the economy going to do? We know there are issues in the global south. We know how hot it's been in India. We know that the combination of heat and extreme humidity is really dangerous. But I think what people don't understand is we're seeing that in North America and Europe as well. Think about the heat waves we've had over the last few years. Think about the excess deaths reported. Recent heat waves have led to, I believe it's an 8 to 9% loss in productivity in Southern Europe and 23% less labour supply in the US. Sorry, Julia, you had a point you wanted to make.
Yeah, no, I think what you said made me think a few things. So first of all, should I retrain as a heat pump technician? Secondly, and more seriously, we should probably, this should start from schools, because I think that, if you are in high school, you're probably not thinking that you want to be a heat pump technician because maybe you don't even know what a heat pump is. So if we had the correct education for children and tell them, look, these are the jobs of the future / the present, there are lots of opportunities in these areas, then we could invite the next generations to get into these industries. I mean, we all recently were talking to someone that was fresh out of university who was saying that one of her friends applied for a job at Shell. A 21-year-old woman decided to go that way because she thought that paid more than other industries. So, we all think that the Gen Z are so, know so much about the current issues, but clearly some of them still think that the money is in the polluting industries. And so if people are not aware of the opportunities out there, we can't expect them to take them. And, and another thought is that I wrote an article a year ago about Ireland investing in training, in upskilling and reskilling people for these green technologies. And I think that's definitely a great step. I'm wondering how many other countries are doing it. So I think there is definitely a lot of work to do. And as you said, governments need to get with businesses, and I would argue with schools, and drop a plan to move forward.
Actually, when you talk about it that way, again, we're coming back to this idea that the system needs to change. We have to stop teaching people that there's only sort of one worthwhile way of making money, and maybe that, I don't know, that I know it's a ridiculous thing to say, but the money is not the only thing. But of course, you can only say that when you've got enough, when you've got enough to live on and you feel good and you can look after yourself and your family and whatever else. But there is just this, seems to me, this fundamental problem that we don't seem to have an understanding of how important it is to value the world around us. And I think about a lot of those people who are working in industries where they can make very, very large amounts of money for doing very, very clever things with finance. And I think, all power to you. That's great. But But I think one of the things I suppose I'm nervous about is when you look at the industries and the jobs that are not responsible for, but reliant on nature. And I'm thinking about agriculture and fishing and all of that kind of stuff. And it's over 1 billion jobs around the world are actually dependent on these things. And what will happen if people can't do those jobs anymore? Because, I suppose I'm interested in whether or not people are prepared to try and take a long-term approach to challenging these problems. Because yes, we need action now, we need policy now, we need investment now, but we also need to address long-term thinking and try and build long-term thinking into the way in which we think about our world.
And I think that plays into what Julia was saying about schools, because it's not just, it's not just presenting school children with a selection of careers that are going to be needed in the future. It's also just about educating them on why it matters. Like, it's all very well saying, yeah, this career pays really well, you should go into that, which I completely agree. We do need to start sort of presenting these options. But it is also just about a fundamental understanding. And I haven't been in a school for a very long time now, but I really do think it's important that children are taught a realistic version of, this is what we've done to the world. Like, we have messed it up. I say we, meaning all of humanity for all of history. It's messed up, and we need to just sort of admit to that. And, we hear it so often, like, oh, well, the next generation is going to have to be the ones that save us. They've been lumped with this. And instead of just kind of talking about that and sort of pushing it under the rug, we really need to air it out in the open. And the more climate science has developed over the years, the more we know now, the more opportunity we have to share that knowledge and prepare upcoming generations for that future.
Yeah, and I think that the educating the new generations is very important when it comes to the jobs, because we can't just expect that people mid-career will reskill for the new jobs. It's a big ask to ask someone that has a full-time job, a routine, a family, commitments, whatever, to then spend their entire free time reskilling. I mean, who's gonna pay for that? Are they gonna do it within their company? Are they gonna reskill for their company? Sometimes some companies do that, but not all of them. How about the people that are out of work? Who's gonna pay for this reskilling? I think that's why it's so crucial to educate the new generations correctly.
And when you're talking about the need for long-term solutions, we need to be, thinking long-term has to be trained in. It's not something you necessarily, nobody wakes up every morning and while having their breakfast and brushing their teeth, you're not thinking 30 odd years into the future, are you? You're thinking about that day, maybe the next day. And that's just the way we are. And we need to overcome that, I think.
I think you're right. But I also think that education needs to happen to people already out in the world and out in work, because there aren't everyday conversations about this kind of thing. And I think there should be. There aren't everyday conversations about where we're going and what we're doing. And it's often seen as being a bit too intense or a bit too political or a bit too this. And actually, we're just trying to have a conversation about the kind of world we want to live in.
Yeah, and I think it's comforting for a lot of people to believe that, the climate has warmed before, and the new technologies are too difficult to roll out. And, I hear that so much in conversations I have with people. And, I try my best to tell them that's not true. But at the same time, I understand it's just it's easier to see the world that way.
And I also, this might be going on a bit of a tangent, but I do think it all becomes very intermingled as well, doesn't it? Because if you think of, say, housing, for example, in the UK, we've got a massive, massive housing problem. So few people own their own homes, and it's becoming less and less possible for upcoming generations to own their homes. If you don't own your home, then what what power do you have to request heat pumps and everything, and landlords who are letting things out, they don't necessarily think through these things. So it really needs to be systematically applied to the way we live our lives in general, is that we need to move away from these, okay, I'll protect what I own, I'll protect my space, I'll think about this for the future. No one is thinking that far into the future. If you don't own your own home, you might be thinking, okay, well, my lease ends in a couple of months, then where do I renew this or go elsewhere? So the long-term thinking just isn't happening anywhere in our daily lives. That was one example. Obviously, it spreads far beyond housing and everything, but it does bleed into everything.
And on that note, I'm going to draw our conversation today to a close, because I think one of the things that we all agree on is that we need system change, and we need people to think about things in the long term. And actually, one of the first things you can do is start a conversation about it. I hope you've enjoyed listening to us today. We'll be back in a few moments. Hello and welcome back. Today we're joined by Neil D'Souza, Chief Executive of software company Makersite, who are pioneering a new approach to sustainable product design. Welcome, Neil. Could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why sustainable product design matters so much? What actually brought you to, develop Makersite?
My career in the space, before it was cool, we were banging on doors of companies telling them there's a better way to do this besides the take, make, waste kind of economy that we built for ourselves. It's been a long journey, right? And the kind of tools that you use to help understand how to make things better start with how are things made, and I think this is the motivation behind Makersite. I think if you look at the impact in the world today, 100% of it comes from products. There's many splits that people talk about. There's 40% from transport and 50% from energy, and some of them will talk about the steel industry and the aluminum industry. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, everything comes from products we make and use. And so if you want to change, you have to change products. And if you want to change a product, you have to change its supply chain. Unfortunately, the problem is that we've constructed supply chains that allow us to build more and more complicated things at greater and greater scale. But what we lose is transparency into how this makes, how we go about making it. Right. And the problem with that is if you want to now go about changing that, which I think we need to do in the next 30 years, I think in the next 30 years, we will not just change the products we make, but how we make them. But if you don't know how they're made, you're in a conundrum. And I think this is what we started. We started on a journey to solve and to provide the ability for companies to solve this at scale, because that's, I think, what we need. This is not a niche problem that you can put into a corner in the hands of a couple of experts in these large companies, but we need to put this in the hands of the 90 million engineers across the world.
Fascinating idea and approach, especially when, that's in the context of UN projections about how much natural resource and material that we're actually going to consume over the next 20 to 30 years and how rapidly it's increasing. So what exactly does Makersite do that will enable these engineers to do things differently?
Exactly what I described, right? So there's about 140 different data feeds that we've put together that provide information, not just about the supply chain involved in manufacturing the product. So think, for example, you're making a screw, right? And you want to put it up on for painting on a wall. It will have a particular grade. You'll buy it from a certain supplier, which will be made in a certain location. There's a certain manufacturing process involved. All you knew is you need a screw. That information about how a screw is made and what is the steel that's behind it, what's the grade, how do you make that, where is it made, what is the energy mix associated with it. This is one level of transparency that we provide to our customers. The second is, what is the implication of that supply chain on cost and compliance and sustainability? And in sustainability, you have many drill downs, right? What is carbon? What is water? What is the circularity score of it? How much recycled material is in there? How recyclable is that material at the end? Those are the kind of layers that we add to the supply chain information. And we do this very early in the design stage where you do not know a lot of information, right? You may not know where you're going to buy this from. You may not know what particular grade of material you're going to buy. And so how do you start with something fuzzy in your early designs and carry that through until you've got a manufacturing bill of material where you know exactly what grades you're going to buy and where you're going to buy from? Right? That's providing this guidance in terms of what is the implication of a design choice across these different criteria, and what's the trade-off that you need to make. That's the value proposition that we provide to our customers.
Okay, so exactly what data is there? So what sort of data sources do you use?
I think there's actually a customer that told me this in a very eloquent way. There's a limited amount of information that a company has about its product. Just think about it, right? So an engineer will design a product, a procurement person will know where to buy these kind of materials from, but it's a very limited amount of information that sits in their product lifecycle management systems and the enterprise resource planning systems. There's a much bigger repository of information that sits outside. What are the supply chains involved? What are the regulations involved? What are the environmental impacts involved? How circular are these materials? Who is involved? Who are the players in the supply chain? This doesn't sit within a company, right? Imagine the ability to combine these two worlds instantaneously when you're making a decision. That's what Makersite provides.
I've got to say, this is a fascinating bringing together of this kind of data, because I'll be honest with you, I can totally see why it's useful for engineers and why it's useful for companies who are planning on creating a new product so they understand it. But if you actually think about all the disclosure frameworks that are being implemented all over the world, it seems like this is something where you'd actually start out knowing the data you needed to report on by the end of your product development cycle. That seems to be something that's really lacking in the market at the moment.
It is not lacking, it is shocking. Right. So it is. If I were making a car, right, I would tell you that an average car maker knows about 40% of how their car is made. 60% of it, they have no idea. This is an average car maker. There are some who are very vertically integrated. Mercedes, Daimler is one of these companies. Tesla is another one of these companies. But for most of these players, they outsource design and manufacturing. I mean, the ECUs of cars that are made by Bosch, nobody knows how these are made. Nobody knows what's in there. And I think this is quite common across different industries, right? It is, and it's designed to be that way. I mean, the ability to specialize means that I, as a supplier, want to protect my IP. I don't want to tell you how it's made. And the more outsourcing I do, the more you have this in your supply chain. So at the end of the day, when you create your product, you actually very often start investigating from scratch how it was made in order to understand what the impact is. And what Makersite is trying to do is reverse that process, right? Could you start with an understanding of how your product is made? Because it's called shifting to the left, right? The more information you have doesn't just make it easier at the end, but it also makes sure you end up at the right result.
The thing that I'm sort of struggling to get my head around with that is, how do you then match up companies' desire to have commercially confidential information kept private and the ability to actually have all the data out?
Yes. So there's this is where a part of my past experience comes in. I remember working with an apparel company, and they had an ambition to collect data from about 20,000 suppliers. Okay, because that's what you would do, right? If you're trying to figure out how to make stuff, and imagine apparel is relatively trivial, fashion, right? A little bit of metal, a little bit of plastic, some textile, a lot of chemical, and that's about it. We're making supercomputers in our phones right now, right? So completely different things. But let's say 20,000 suppliers involved. After 3 years, they managed to get responses from 53 out of 20,000. Okay, so the thing is that this is not going to change, but if you now flip this story, right, chemical producers have for decades been forced to provide information about what are the critical components in their chemicals. Not 100% coverage, but a large majority of it. In terms of the automotive space, there has been what is called IMDS, which has been around Europe ever since we've had REACH and RoHS regulations, which force suppliers to tell you what are the harmful substances that are there in your product. Right? And you have this in every sector. There is pieces of information that have been extracted from the supply chain. The question is, could you use that smartly to uncover what is actually happening in that supply chain? That's what we do, right? We found a smart way to reverse engineer some of this data, to put it together in smart ways, to uncover this piece of information, right? These pieces of information. And it works beautifully because this is regulated data. It is as accurate as it gets. And it is already out there.
So basically, what you're doing is taking the individual pieces that regulations have forced companies in different sectors to publish and bring those together in such a way that it tells the whole story of a material's life.
Exactly. You think about it, right? If you're making a car, there will be some bits of it that are metals, right? There will be some that are plastics. There are some that are chemicals, textiles, and so on and so forth. And for each of these industries, you have their own programs and industry initiatives which have created transparency for different reasons. Now, if you find a smart way to repurpose this data, to put it together, you get the footprint of a car at the end. And that's the heavy lifting that we've done over the last 6 years.
Excellent. So, I mean, one of the things we touched on is the need for the shift in the way we make things, the need to shift away from the take, make, waste. So, clearly we need to be investing in more sustainable product design. But I think, a lot of companies might see this as a cost, as a burden. Can you explain why it's an opportunity as well as a necessity?
So we do not sell to any company where we haven't managed to convince them that this is not an opportunity. If you look at how companies work, right, they will prioritize one of four things: growth, that is more money; risk, that is the ability to deliver product even when there are problems in the supply chain or there's problems in the market with your customers. They will look at cost. So can we make it cheaper, right? And brand, which is, can we increase our win rate compared to competition? That's more or less how business leaders think, right? They will not do anything that doesn't fit into one of these four criteria, in one of these four categories. Each of these maps to better product at the end. If you think about it, right? If you can design a more sustainable product, there are statistics that have proven that you could get 25 to 27% more. I think these numbers have gone down a bit now in terms of premiums. So you could principally grow revenue. You could access bigger markets. There are certain regulations here in Europe and now also in the US, where you cannot access certain markets and certain sectors unless you disclose information about your products. And in some cases also disclose that your products are more sustainable compared to the status quo, right? I think in each of these, we have always created business cases for our customers where there's a reason to make better products. And I think history has proven that there's been, I remember when we were back in 2005 and we were trying to create these business cases, people always questioned us, saying, yes, we may be expecting to make more money. We may be expecting to be more successful. We may be expecting that people will pay higher premiums. We're a long way from 2005. We have data that has proven each of these has happened, and in substantial ways that is forcing companies, or actually compelling product managers within companies, to think like this, that it is not just about creating a report at the end. I mean, if you think of what is reporting at the end, right? You could get a report out of an Excel sheet. It's not a big problem. You can, and then the more accurate you want to be, you spend a little more money, but it's always spending money, and you want to always limit that. And it's a conundrum because the more money you spend, the more transparency you get, the better you could become. But if this was always about spending money, you will never get there, right? And so the way is to flip that and always talk about eco-design and sustainability in the context of these four main business drivers. Can I help you win against competition by positioning your product better? Can I help you access markets that you otherwise could not because your product is now compliant and safer? And that's how we drive sustainability. And I've always believed, I think this was it was when I first entered this field, my first boss told me, he's like, Neil, we're not the kind of people that want to hug trees, right? There's a place for those kind of people. We're in industry. If a person wants to drive a Porsche, please do drive a Porsche. Just make sure this is the most sustainable Porsche you can drive. I'm from the city of Stuttgart, so we talk in terms of Porsches, but but you could apply this for anything, right? I think if you think of this in a different way, it is impossible to turn a ship without a motor running, right? You have to be moving forward. So I believe that you will not change our destiny in the next 30 years unless we're making more sustainable products. It is not about making less or consuming less. It's about consuming more better products. And I think our goal is to guide that. And if you think about how much time we have, this sounds like we have a lot of time. But until 2050, right? An average technical product, Elsa, takes about 6 years to go to market. That means we have 5 chances, right? Just 5. Imagine you're a product developer and you have 5 chances to take that product and make it have 0 impact. That's not a lot of time, right? So that's the thing, that you need to move differently. You need to move at a different pace, and you need different kinds of tools to get you there.
Now, that makes a lot of sense. There was a fascinating report that came out last month, I think it was, about the UK, when it said that the clean tech sector was showing 9% growth against an average economic growth in the UK of 1%. That's 90% more growth. So, kind of says you might be sitting in the right area. I mean, one of the things I'd love to know more about is Makersite as a company. What have been your biggest achievements to date?
We are very closely linked with the success of our company, of our customers, right? It's not just, I think there's many companies where, excuse me, there are many companies where there is a separation between how a company makes money and therefore is successful, and how their customers are successful, right? It's not always obvious. With us, the more products we can make transparent for our customers, the more products we can improve for our customers, the more money we make and the more successful we are. It's a very direct relationship. So I think one of the things that we're most proud of is when customers come up with new product, or they come out with impact reductions. So there was I think it was Paka last year, where they claimed that they reduced about 70% of their impacts from their product as a consequence of the work that we did together. Right, 70%. That's fantastic. I think it was yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, Microsoft released their newest Surface laptop, one of the greenest laptops that they've ever designed, and they designed it with the goal of being the most sustainable laptop that they could have designed. And this is also something that we power these kind of decisions and the data behind it. There's tons of these stories that are not public, simply because we work in a very protected environment. But these are just some that I think. Schaeffler was another thing where they designed a new supply chain for their battery manufacturing on the basis of how do you optimize it, right? And this is on our website as well, and you can look at how they did this.
Fantastic. Now, I mean, because you've got customers like Microsoft, which you've mentioned, and Cummins and BMW. How broad an industrial base do you have? I mean, do you have clients in every sector?
No. And the reason is we're pretty focused, right? So we're a small company. We're not 10,000 people yet. We'll get there at some point, but at the moment we need to pick our battles, and we look at certain sectors where there is a high momentum and high maturity, and an intersection of these two things, right? Where companies have already understood that there's a reason to do this, and they want to do it. They're serious about it, but there's also a certain level of maturity in the data you need to be able to do this. We work with billions of data points, right? And if a customer does not have information that is usable for the kind of work that we do, imagine you can take a car, the definition of a car, throw it in a Makersite, and we can elaborate an entire supply chain out of it. Right. This is not something trivially done unless you have quite some maturity in terms of data and you know how to manage this. I think this is where you find that while we work with many different sectors, you will find trends where it is chemicals, building and construction, electronics and consumer goods, automotive. These are the kind of sectors that we do very well because of this intersection of two things.
And these are all sectors which have significant environmental footprints which need to be addressed.
Absolutely. And there are also the ones that are very chemicals too, right? So these are also very very complicated sectors. It's not trivial to solve these problems with an Excel file and a piece of paper. Right? You need sophisticated tools to be able to do this.
Absolutely. So, I mean, really what Makersite is doing is bringing together all these different elements of sort of cost and risk and compliance and environmental impact and saying, here's the data, use this to create a better product with lower impact, use this to create a new supply chain if you want to, and use this to understand what the implications are of the products you have.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, product design is about trade-off. Right. And in the past, it has always been that you can do, I mean, there is a science of calculating costs of a product. There's a science of doing an environmental assessment. There's a science of doing a compliance assessment. Right. The only problem is these have always been obfuscated. They're always way down in the stage gate process. So you've already designed your product and then you principally do this as a checkbox exercise, right, for reporting. But at the end of the day, if you could have this information up front, it is all about making a trade-off. I can make it cheaper, but what is the impact going to be? If I could make that transparent, and this is not just in design, right? There's two things. There's two engines of a company. There's making and buying. There's engineers who design something, and then there's procurement that buys something. And if you can help both these people understand what is the consequence of their decision, you will end up with better results. Think about it. If I were to put a label on the cup that you drink coffee out of and say there were children used in making that cup, would you buy that cup? No. But the reason we buy our cups is because nobody put that on. All you need to do is make it transparent. I think people genuinely make better decisions as a consequence of it. And in my 20 years of experience, I've seen it every single time.
Yeah, no, I mean, that speaks so strongly to sort of our mission at Shaken Not Burned, because we're always going on about transparency, because it is that thing that if you can get people to understand the consequences of their decisions and have those consequences readily available for everybody to see, you then have to be accountable for those decisions that you make. And that, for me, it encapsulates everything we love to talk about and everything we're really excited to meet companies who are, making that happen. So, on that note, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us today. My last question is always my favorite. Is there anything we haven't asked you about that you'd like to talk about?
I'd like to tell everyone we released what we call the Eco-Design Dashboard about 3 days ago. And this is a phenomenal accomplishment for us. I mean, for the longest time, if you want to make a product better, the process has always been you need to model it. Then you need to understand where the hotspots sit. Then you need to identify opportunities to mitigate that. And then you make trade-offs, right? And this has been, every step of that requires a different kind of expertise. What if you could remove that entirely? What if you could just take a product and the system would tell you how to make it better? That's what this dashboard does for our customers now. It's pretty fantastic. And if you go to our website, you will see exactly how it works on a video.
Well, I encourage everyone to go and have a look. On that note, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us, Neil. It's been fascinating learning about Makersite, and I look forward to seeing everybody improve their product design. Thanks again to our listeners. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and please join us next week. Subscribe to the podcast, and we'll be back with you soon. Thank you.